Well, good morning. So glad to see you on this Sunday. We're wrapping up our look at Mark chapter 2 as I try to preach through the Gospel of Mark, take the stories that Mark tells about Jesus and see what we can learn from those lessons. We're looking at Jesus and the Sabbath. Mark chapter 2, verse 23 to 28. Jesus is going to deal with the issue that is put to him by the Pharisees. It relates to the Sabbath day. Now, when I use the word Sabbath, we're all on the same page, right? You know what I'm talking about. Sabbath is Saturday, seventh day of the week. It's the holy day for Jews, has been ever since Moses gave it on the Ten Commandments. The fourth commandment, honor the Sabbath day, keep it holy. They've been keeping it ever since. Also, the Muslims who use the Old Testament and they adhere to Moses, they still gather on a Saturday. There are some churches that do so. We call them Sabbatarian churches, or Seventh Day, like the Seventh-day Adventists, and they meet on Saturday, wonder why you and I don't. You see, the question about Sabbath has been around for a long time. There's always issues that need to be dealt with, and so we're going to get an occasion to watch Jesus as he deals with the question regarding Sabbath day. Now, we want to start first with the idea of Sabbath rules. Sabbath rules, and we'll start with verse 23 as Mark tells us the story. Here's what Mark says. He says there's a Sabbath day, and Jesus is out traveling. He's walking. He's on a country road, and there's grain fields on both sides. And as he walks through the grain fields, his disciples are gathering heads of grain from the nearby grain field. Now, what's being described there is something that Moses talked about in the law. It's the law of gleaning. When it comes to gleaning, Moses said that farmers are to leave the portion of their field that's there near the roadway, so many feet within, and that's available for strangers, for travelers as they're walking through, reach and get a snack. Now you see, when it comes to snack time, you and I, if we're out traveling, we got all of these options. We'll pull into a convenience store, a gas station, we'll pull through a drive-through, we get a snack, we keep moving. Didn't have such things back in those days, but Moses provided that you could take from the fields the strip right there. And so the disciples are taking the heads of grain. Luke describes how they're rubbing their hands together. Now, rubbing their hands, they're breaking up the kernels so they can get the part they want to eat. If you can't identify with that, think about what you do in one of those steak restaurants, one of those roadhouses, where they've got the big barrel of peanuts. What do? You grab a handful while you stand there waiting on your table. You crack those things, you eat, you toss the shells on the floor, and you'll do that. You'll get to your table. You still may be cracking a few of those things eating. That's what they're doing. They're just taking a snack that is acceptable by law because you get to take the gleanings. You get to take what's there on the side, the handfuls. Now, what you can't do is run home, get your equipment, come and harvest that strip all the way around, take it home, put it in your barn. It's not for that purpose. It's there for people to take advantage of when they need a handful of something to eat. The gleaning laws also allowed for picking up the leftovers. As someone is harvesting their fields, they only get to pick up the grain once. You gather up a handful of grain, you walk to the wagon, and you put it in and take off to your barn. Whatever drops out of your hand stays on the ground so that others can come along after you, the needy, and they can pick up from that and they can eat. So what the disciples are doing on this occasion, what they're doing is not a problem. They're not being criticized for that. It's when they're doing it. Verse 24 says, it was a Sabbath day, and so the Pharisees raised the question, why are your disciples doing what's unlawful on a Sabbath? You see, the rule of Sabbath from the Old Testament was you're to honor the Sabbath day, which means no work on a Sabbath day. So they're interpreting what they're doing as they rub their hands, they're interpreting that as a work that's inappropriate on a Saturday. So why you let your disciples do that? Now, what is happening here is something Jesus deals with many times in the Gospels. It'll be this, it'll be that. It doesn't matter what it is, but he and his disciples will be doing some activity, and the Pharisees will interpret it as you're breaking the rules. You're working on a Sabbath day. And so time and time again, Jesus has to defend his disciples. And in doing so, try to set them straight on how to deal with the Sabbath and its rules. Now, what you have here is what's happened over time, not just with the Sabbath rule, but really all of God's Old Testament rules that were given by Moses. That God gave rules through Moses that were oftentimes very simple rules, didn't say much at all. But over time, there will be various traditions that will interpret those rules. And the interpretations will not be the same, they'll be varied. As the Jewish leaders will try to figure out how to take a simple rule and apply it to today, they often created elaborate, complex traditions. Now, what did Moses say about the Sabbath? Well, don't work on the Sabbath. He didn't define it, just said it. He did give a little bit more. At least you'll see it, for example, in the case of bread from heaven. Remember how in the wilderness they had manna from heaven, came down every day except Sabbath day. So on Friday, take a double dose of bread as you're out collecting the bread that falls from heaven, because on Sabbath there's not going to be any bread that falls. You'll just have to collect double. And likewise, firewood. If you're going to light up the fire to cook anything on the Sabbath, gather your wood on Saturday and have it ready on Friday and have it ready for the Sabbath, so that you're not working on the Sabbath gathering up that firewood. Now, beyond that, he didn't say much more. So the Jews created traditions. And over time, they created a lot of traditions. So, for example, one of the traditions was travel. If you're going to walk on the Sabbath day, and walking was their means of transportation, you can only go so far, and after that, don't go. That's work. They define the so far as something short of a mile, and once you go past that, you're working on the Sabbath. That's wrong. They also took day-to-day activities that would happen on a Sabbath day, and then took them and defined which ones are work and which ones are not. So, for example, you can actually have a meal. That's fine. That's not work. And you could wash the dishes, but you can't wash the windows. Washing the windows, that gets into work. Washing the dishes, okay. Now, I'm actually okay with that because I hate washing the windows. I'm fine with the excuse to get out of it. But I still look at this. How did the washing of one and the washing of another, how did one constitute work and the other one didn't? Where'd you come up with that? Likewise, they went through all the other activities of the day and designated which ones you can do, which ones you can't do, because it's the Sabbath and we don't work on the Sabbath. Their traditions became so complex and sometimes so ridiculous that as you read them today, you wonder, how did people buy into that? Take, for example, what if a beggar comes to your house on a Sabbath day and you want to do the right thing, the charitable thing, and give them a donation? They had rules about how you could and could not do that as far as the Sabbath rules. For example, you take your coin that you want to hand them and you put your hand above their hand, and if you drop the coins, that's not work. Now, if you're under their hand and you hand it to them, that's work. So put your hand on top and you're okay. Or have them reach their hand in the threshold of your house and hand them the money and you're okay. But if you reach beyond the threshold and hand it to them, you're working. Sometimes we look at these traditions and we say that some of this looks crazy. And yet that's what happens. When God speaks, and then over time we interpret and apply, before you know it, we create all types of traditions and rituals and rules that go well beyond whatever God originally said. That's what Jesus is confronting. He's being challenged because in their tradition, they've defined the cracking of the grain, the cracking of some peanuts, if you will, and they're calling that work. You and I look at it saying, that's not much work. Well, that's why Jesus has to respond to them. And so we talk about the Sabbath Lord. That's Jesus, the Sabbath Lord. Here's the way he describes himself in verse 28. He says, the Son of Man, he's the Lord of the Sabbath. Now, Son of Man was the title they used for the Christ, the Messiah, in that first century. It was their preferred title. We call him Christ, we call him Messiah, we call him Savior, but they like to refer to him by that Daniel title, the Son of Man. So Jesus uses that title. He says, so here I am, the Son of Man, the Messiah, the Christ, and I'm the Lord of the Sabbath. Now, what he's doing is not taking advantage of his position of authority and saying, because I'm in charge, because I'm the key authority, I can do what I want. I can break rules. Listen, we don't like people that do that. We don't like it when a government leader, for example, ignores the rules of the country and the rules of the land and says, I'm above the law. We say, no, these are the laws for all of us, including you. We don't like it when a parent sets down a household rule and then breaks the rule, because after all, I'm the parent here. I'm in charge. So we like for people to respect the rules and live by them even as they lead. Jesus is not a rule breaker, as some people like to call him. Now, what Jesus will do is challenge the traditions that have been built around the rules. He takes you back to the original intent of the rules. So what he's claiming in this text is, as Christ, I have authority, and my interpretation of the Sabbath rules should outweigh the interpretation of the rabbis. So all the centuries, you've had these different rabbis. Each one interprets that rule and tells you what it means and how to apply it. And then you take all the different interpretations, because they don't agree, and you rank them as to which rabbi you respect more than the other. This one's got more clout. He's more prestigious. I trust him more than this one, and he's higher, this one's higher. You ought to put the Messiah right there at the top. When the Messiah speaks and interprets a rule of God for you, that ought to count more than all the rest of them combined. That's what Jesus is saying. Now, in doing that, he also gives a bonus. He tells the story of David. Verse 25, he says, have you read the story of David? When he was on the run and he was hungry and he was in need. Verse 26, how he and his companions, they ran out there to the tabernacle, the sanctuary of God, the holy house. And they needed something to eat. There was nothing there to eat except the consecrated bread reserved for the priests. And so they took that bread and they ate it. Remember that story? That's what Jesus asked. Now, I don't know if you remember the story or not. Let me remind you. David, in his younger years, was often on the run. King Saul wanted him dead. Told his soldiers, if you find David, kill him. And every time David would find a safe house somewhere that he could stay for a while, at some point he'd be found out. And when Saul and his men would come and surround the house, he'd have to sneak through them and get on the run and get away from them as fast as he could. Usually without getting to pack any provisions, couldn't do much more than just run. And as they're running, they can't do like you and I do. If you were running for your life, you've seen that in TV shows where somebody's on the lam and they're running as fast as they can, trying to get away. They can still pull into a convenience store and grab something to eat, pull through a drive-through, quickly grab something to eat, but David couldn't do that. So what could he do? He went to the sanctuary, the tabernacle, the tent is way out in an isolated area, so he'd be safe there. What kind of food can he find here? Well, not much, really. It's not a place that keeps food. There is, every Sabbath day, the showbread, the 12 loaves of bread that are put out on the table. They're just there for show. They're symbolism. And so they're sitting there symbolic, and they just sit all week long. At the end of the week, a fresh batch of 12 loaves are put out on the table, and those are put in the pantry, and the priest will use those and eat those the next week. They're for the priest to eat. What will happen is David will go in, and he'll use that bread. He and his friends will eat that bread. The priests will share their bread with David. Now, some would say, well, that's wrong. That's the priest's bread. Here's David interpreting it this way. Our life's at stake. We're on the run and we're weak and we need our nourishment, and they're sharing with us their bread so that we can survive, so that we can eat, saving a life. See, David is interpreting how the rules work and how God intends the rules to work. Now, in doing so, the Pharisees don't usually jump all over David. They love David. King David, he's the great king, and he is a symbol, a messianic typology of the coming Messiah. See, David represents what Messiah will be when Messiah comes. That's how high they hold David. Messiah is the son of David. So what Jesus is saying is, so David takes a rule, but he interprets that rule as to how it ought to apply in a life situation, and you respect him for that. Now, I'm here taking the rules of God, and I will interpret them and apply them to life situations. And I would think that when the Son of Man, when the Messiah does that, you would respect that as well. That's what he's arguing. And then he's ready to interpret the Sabbath rule. That's verse 27. Here's Jesus' interpretation of the Sabbath rule of God. His interpretation is that the Sabbath was made for man. It wasn't man made for the Sabbath. When God made the Sabbath rule, he did it in our best interest. Now, that's a good way to describe all of God's rules. All those rules that say, thou shalt not, don't do this, don't do that, we see them as, they're restricting me, they're keeping me from doing things I want to do. Jesus says, no, look at them a different way. This is God trying to set a rule that's in your best interest, trying to help you live your life the way it ought to be lived. In the case of the Sabbath rule, God is saying you need to take a day of rest. Here's the Creator. He designed you. He understands you. He knows you inside and out, knows you better than you know yourself because he made you as your creator. And God says you need to take a day every week and take a rest. Now, I like that idea of telling you what you need to do because it's for your own good. That's what you do with children. I remember with our daughter, as she was growing up, my wife and I would give her bedtime. And it changed a little through the years as she's growing. It didn't change a lot. Because my wife said, I know how much sleep she needs. I've seen her when we let her stay up some night, when we let her friends over, whatever. It takes me 2 or 3 days to deal with her afterwards, get her right back on track. Because if she doesn't get her sleep, she's irritable, she's grouchy, she's this or that. So she needs her sleep. So I just gave her the rule of here's what you are. Now, she'd go to school and in her different grades, she could come home and tell me the list of all the friends, call them by name, who get a step later than her. It's not fair. I don't care about your friends. This is your time. Because you need this. And sure enough, today when I visited her in her home in Savannah, she's got my grandsons. And while she told me, well, I'm not going to give any rules to my kids. They've got a bedtime. She knows what they need, and she makes sure they get to bed at their time. And She goes to bed at a reasonable time, in fact, a little earlier than me, and I'm pretty early, because she's figured out finally what her parents told her. You need your rest. See, Moses treats the Israelites like spiritual children. They've just come out of Egypt. This is a brand new thing, this thing of Judaism, as we call it. And as Moses lays down the laws, he oftentimes takes what God says and puts it into a rule. And so you need a day of rest, he tells them, and I'll designate your day for you. It'll be Saturday, and you'll not work on Saturday. So that's how you deal with children. You just lay it out for them. Now, when you do that and you give them something, it's for their own good, and it's not intended to be an oppressive burden. You shouldn't look at it that way. That's how we look at things. God's burdening me. He's oppressing me. He's restricting me, and you're not getting the point. You're not seeing the benefits. Now, take, for example, the way we approach an alarm clock. You set your alarm clock, and then when it goes off, then you complain and grumble. You talk about the alarm clock, that cursed alarm clock. Listen, folks, if you don't like it, don't set it. Now, you're thinking, well, then I'd be late for work. I'd be in trouble. That's right. You set it for a purpose. That thing was a tool to get you up and moving to do what you need to do. You did it to help you. And you say, yeah, I don't like it anyway. That's fine, but it was there for your good. It wasn't there to be a burden. And if you're saying, well, the alarm clock's not giving me enough sleep. No. Back it up on the start. When you go to bed, it's probably you didn't give yourself enough sleep. You set the alarm to accomplish what needs to be accomplished. You see, that's how God's rules work. God gives rules not to hurt you, not to oppress you. He gives rules that are actually for your good. And when he says, don't do this, don't do that, he has in mind, if you follow my guidelines, your life will be better for it. And that's how Jesus interprets the rules of God, including the Sabbath. The Sabbath wasn't made for man. Man wasn't made for the Sabbath. The Sabbath was made for man. It was made to guide man. It was made to give man a better way of living. Now come back to that Sabbath rule and think about it. In the case of the Sabbath, God says every week you need to take a break. You need to take a rest from your work, so don't work on that day. The idea of work would be whatever it is that you do every day to provide for yourself, provide for your family, the breadwinner concept. And so this is what I do to make ends meet, to pay my bills, and then I need to take a day where I don't do that. I do something else. The something else is supposed to be a rest, a refreshment, a recreating of yourself so I can get back to work the next week and work hard again. And then I take a break, and then I get back to work and I take a break. The Creator says that's what you need. Your body, your mind needs that. Now think about it. That's why we talk about recreation, fun stuff. It recreates us. Now what I would suggest to you is as you apply that, it's not going to look the same for everybody. That is, what is your rest isn't necessarily my rest. You know, if a guy works all day, all week in an office, you're a desk jockey, that's what you do. Getting outdoors and doing something that gives you a chance to use your muscles and have fun or work or whatever, that's good. Because then you refresh and come back to sitting at that desk again. Guy that works outside and doing all this manual labor outside, a day of just sleeping in the hammock might sound pretty good. You know, if you spend all week long and you're looking at a computer monitor doing whatever you're doing, then on your day off, you may not even want to turn on the computer. Do something else. On the other hand, if you're always doing something else, you might decide your day off is playing video games all day long. Listen, it's basically finding out what is it that will recharge me, that will get me going. And sometimes what recharges us puts out a lot of energy, a lot of sweat. And boy, when I get down, I had a lot of fun. I feel satisfied, but it's a change. It's a change that refreshes. Now I'm back at what I normally do. See, when you understand that, you're starting to get the idea of the Sabbath. The Sabbath was made for us to give us a break from our work so we can do something that recharges us and gets us back to work and working effectively. You know, even common sense says if you're burning both candles at both ends, burning candle at both ends, you're going to burn out. No. If you're saying, well, I don't know how I'll survive. I can't hardly make it unless I just work all 7 days doing these multiple jobs. Something's wrong in your life that needs to be worked out. But the Creator says, if you're not wise and smart about your body and your mind, you're going to pay for it. You got to have that Sabbath rest. So it is, Jesus is challenged. You're letting them work on the Sabbath. That's not work. That's not what God was talking about. And then he points them back to what God really meant, where you understand the Sabbath concept and then apply it in a way that actually works for your life. It was for us, not us, for the Sabbath. That brings us then to the idea of Sabbath principle. If somebody were to ask me, so Pressley, do you believe in the Sabbath? Do you honor the Sabbath? Well, for me, that's a yes or no. That is, it's a no if you're talking about the Sabbath rule of the Jews, the one that Moses gave them. That Saturday is to be your holy worship day. That Saturday you can't do this and can't do that. No, I'm not into that. That was a Jewish thing. And the New Testament doesn't require that of the church. New Testament doesn't lay out those same rules for the church. We don't have a Sabbath rule of that sort. Fact is, Colossians chapter 2 says we're free from such things. But on the other hand, if you ask me, do you believe in the Sabbath principle? I still believe in that and teach that today. Sabbath principle goes all the way back to creation. Genesis chapter 2, God is creating in 6 days in chapter 1. And then chapter 2, verse 2, on the seventh day he ceased from his creating. His work of creation stopped. And then he took the seventh day, it says in the text, and he made that a holy day, a special day, because that's the day he ceased from creating. Now think about it. God is God the omnipotent. He didn't need a break. He didn't need a rest. He could just keep going 24/7. That's God. But God intentionally worked 6 days of creation and stopped for a day to teach us a lesson. And that's the lesson Moses then took in Exodus 20 and made it into a rule for the Jews. And so it is, remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy, he said. And so you can work 6 days, but on that seventh day, don't work, because that's what God showed us when he created for 6 days and then stopped and took a break on the seventh. You see, he took the principle and made a rule for them to live by. And that's the idea of the Sabbath. So Sabbath rule, that was a Jewish thing, their rule. Sabbath principle, that's for all of us. And you would be wise to listen to the Sabbath principle. What I recommend is this. You should live by the Sabbath principle and use good common sense to figure out how to apply it. And as you use good common sense, it won't be the same as your neighbor, but still use good common sense to figure out how to apply this thing. Now, even Jesus taught that time and time again, that you Jews, as you're trying to figure out how to apply the Sabbath, if you stop and think about it, you have realized that it has to be applied within reason. So, for example, he said, how many of you, if you had a child fall into a pit or a well on the Sabbath day, how many of you would wait till the next day because I can't work on the Sabbath? Not one of you. You'd go in there and rescue your child. You'd rescue an animal that fell into a pit. He says, in fact, you get up every morning and still give food and water to your animals, even if it's the Sabbath. And they say, well, yeah, you can't do that to animals, not feed them, not give them water. Yeah, that's right. You've interpreted the rule to allow that. You don't go and take them out and go farming with them, but you do feed them and give them water. Or like, for example, circumcision. It's supposed to be on day number 8 after a male child is born. If that falls on a Sabbath, they'll have a circumcision. You see, Jesus says, you've figured out that when it says don't work on the Sabbath, it doesn't exclude everything. You have to use good common sense to figure out what do you not do. If your roof was collapsing, the Jewish tradition would say if your roof was starting to collapse on a Sabbath, you could take poles and beams and prop it up. Just wait till the next day to do the actual work. If someone had a critical injury on a Sabbath day, a doctor could do first aid and stabilize and then come to my office tomorrow and we'll do the treatment. So you guys figured out how to use common sense to figure out when do I stop my labor, my daily work, but what can I do and still be within the bounds of the Sabbath principle? That's what I'm teaching you as well. In fact, not just the Sabbath idea, but really all of God's rules. All of God's Old Testament rules are so ancient you might think they're not worth talking about, but they are, because behind every rule is always a principle, a spirit that needs to be applied using good common sense. We're not bound by the regulations and the rules and traditions of old, but we do take what's there and figure out how do we apply it to today. And so it is, you need to find your rest. Now your rest will be different from mine. I work on Sundays. I feel exhausted by the time I finish Sunday, especially when we have our Sunday evening program as well. I did a different day. Actually, we got some in our church that Sunday is also a work day. That's fine. They'll find a different day, and that's their Sabbath rest. And we'll each one rest differently. But the key is that you listen to the Creator and figure out how to take the principle he taught. The principle Moses turned into a rule, but take the principle and figure out what the rule will be for your life. Now, about Sunday, since I mentioned that to you, we sometimes talk about the Jews, how those silly Jews always made these traditions about Sabbath. But, some of us grew up in church where there were church traditions, Sunday traditions. Can't work on a Sunday. Except the New Testament didn't say that. In fact, those early Christians, their Roman bosses, their Jewish bosses aren't going to give them Sunday off. It wasn't a day off. They worked and then went to church in the evening. Sometimes we have traditions about things you shouldn't do on a Sunday. Shouldn't mow your grass. Should be playing ball. Some of you may say, well, I remember when I was younger, we couldn't do it. It seems like we do it today. Things have changed. Traditions always change. because they're made by us and they change by us over time. They are, after all, just traditions. You see, I would caution you about traditions. Have your traditions. I mean, you can create a long list of all the things you don't think should be done on a Sunday, and then you don't do it because, after all, you don't want to go against your conscience. But don't use your list of traditions and judge someone else. Their list may be different. Because, after all, if they're not stated in God's Word, they are just the traditions of men. So I've got a short list now from what I grew up with. I still have a few things I don't do on Sunday. I just don't want to. It doesn't feel right. You notice I'm not sharing with you what they are because you don't have to have my list. You'll figure out how to take the Sabbath rest principle and how to take the Lord's Day and figure out what to do with those things. So I'll tell you what, on a Sunday afternoon, if I drive by your place and you're out doing something and you're wondering, what does Pressley think? I'm not going to say a word. I'm going to roll down the window, wave, honk the horn, make you wonder what I'm thinking, but I'm not going to say a word. Because each one of us had to figure out how to take the whole idea of rest and respect for the Lord and all those things and apply them in a way that actually works, typically how it works for us. Well, that's the lesson that we want to learn from Jesus as he deals with the Sabbath. It's one particular question, but really it's the age-old question. Because even the New Testament is 2,000 years ago, law of Moses much longer than that. And we've got to learn how to take the Word of God, those ancient words of God, and bring them into our modern times where they're still relevant and alive and true to us and apply to our lives. And they can, if we can follow the lead of Jesus, looking for the intent of God, the spirit of the rule, and then with good common sense, figure out how to apply it to today. And folks, when we're doing that, then we're taking the Word of God and letting it speak to us today in a real and meaningful way.